This book is the most remarkable piece of literature this world has ever seen. The Bible has outsold every other publication, been translated into more languages than any other. Some people were so committed to the concept of this being God's book that they were even willing to die for that proposition. At the hands of Nero, they were fed to the lions, where they were burned at the stake by Bloody Mary, Queen of England. Others used this same book as a justification for crusades that killed hundreds of thousands of innocent people. This is the story of how the Bible survived from the time of Moses until it reached the shores of America on the Mayflower.
After the death of Wycliffe, the people who had followed him considered themselves to be operating independent of the Roman Church. They, for example, believed in the priesthood of all believers, and they believed it was only proper that they would be allowed to administer the sacraments without the authority of a bishop. Besides that, there was a tremendous contrast between the Wycliffites and the Roman priests. The Wycliffite followers were poor people. The Roman priests had an opulence that made them obviously contrasting. When the Wycliffites went out to preach, they preached in the vernacular of people, but a Roman priest conducted services in the dead language of Latin, and that gave the Wycliffites a tremendous success publicly. They were such an enormous success that one of the critics said that if you were to meet two men walking down the streets, one of them would be a Wycliffite. And that gave them tremendous courage. Courage so that they placarded slogans and insults in all the public places. In fact, in 1395, they made a request of Parliament that they would abolish celibacy and transubstantiation and prayers for the dead and offerings unto images. In fact, they took the booklet that was written by Wycliffe on the 12 conclusions, and they nailed it in such public places as St. Paul's Cathedral and to this place behind me, which is Westminster Abbey. This caused an uproar with the bishops and clergy. This was tantamount to blasphemy against the Church. In 1399, the Bishop of York aligned with King Henry VI. It was he who placed the crown on the head of this new king and stated to him at the coronation to consolidate the throne, conciliate the clergy, and sacrifice the Lollards. Lollards was an abusive term for Wycliffe's followers, meaning mumblers. Henry replied to the prelate, "I will be the protector of the Church." 2 years later, in 1401, the Act for Burning Heretics was passed by the Parliament, and the Bishop of York had accomplished his counter-Reformation objectives. It was only within 8 days of the passage of that bill that they started lighting the fires here at Smithfield, so they would burn to death those that they did not agree with. The first man that they picked was a man by the name of William Sotry. And William Sotry had committed a crime. He was heard to say that he adored not the cross on which Christ died as much as the Christ who died upon the cross. And for that, they dragged him to the precincts of St. Paul's Cathedral. They shaved his head, they put on a layman's cap, and they degraded him. And then they handed him over to civil authorities so that he might have mercy extended to him. The mercy that was given by civil authorities was to bring him here to Smithfield, build a faggot of woods around his body and burn him until he was dead. And he was only the first in a large noble army of Wycliffites that died for their faith.
The quality of these persecuted people is exemplified by Lord Cobham. He became a disciple to Wycliffe's theology. He was brought to trial at St. Paul's on September the 23rd in 1413. When he was questioned and the shouting priest demanded that he believe, he responded, "I am willing to believe all that God desires, but that the Pope should have authority to teach what is contrary to the Scripture, that I can never believe." He was led back to the Tower of London.
They immediately brought him back to his prison, and they gave him 40 days before his intended execution. During that 40 days, they hoped that he would recant, and his recantation would weaken the cause of the Wycliffe followers. But something amazing happened that I cannot explain. His prison was the Tower of London here behind me, and the night before his intended execution, he escaped from there. To my knowledge, nobody else has ever done that in history. And from there he went to Wales. And he was gone for a considerable period of time until December of 1417, when he was recaptured. And then he was brought back to the area and taken to St. Giles' Field. And there they chained him to a rotisserie. And they turned him around like they would roast a hog. And before a slow burning fire, they roasted him to death. What you are looking at is the Lollards Tower. It is attached to Lambeth Palace, which is the City of London residence for the Archbishop of Canterbury. I'd like to tell you the story of the building of that tower. A little room on the very top of it was added, which is known as the Lollards Prison. It's only 12 by 12 with a 7-foot ceiling. It has old rusty iron rings that are still attached to the wall, and where some of those prisoners, after they had been tortured, were held in chains until they were brought out to die, they left etchings on the wall. One of those etchings says, "Jesus amor meus." It means that Jesus is my love. It is impossible to stand in that little room without honestly being moved to tears. The second emotional result of the constitutions of Arundel happened in the city of Norwich. There were so many of Wycliffe's followers who were publicly executed for their faith that the place of public execution to this day is known as the Lollard Pit. That's because so many Lollards died there. Now these Lollards were being burned to death all over the country. That just shows you the excessive, unbelievable number of people who were the followers of Wycliffe and who were willing to live for their faith until they died by burning. Few crusades in human history have met with the overwhelming success that attended the followers of Wycliffe. 125 years later, they were as numerous and as active as they had been at the time when Wycliffe was living. And at that time, they started a reformation that literally turned Europe upside down. Nothing better illustrates the Renaissance than the sculpture by Bernini in the Piazza Navona. If I were to try and define the Middle Ages politically, I would have to begin at the fall of Rome and end at the discovery of America in 1492. If I were to try and define it religiously, I would begin at the conversion of Constantine and end at the publication of a Greek New Testament. But no matter how I try to define the edges of it, one thing is important. I must make a distinction in the middle. There is a difference between the Dark Ages and the Renaissance, and that came about in 3 stages.
When Charlemagne became the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire in 800 AD, he gradually established schools for training priests and monks. He ordered manuscripts of books, especially the Bible, to be copied with extreme care. The church became the guardians of education. The movement flourished from the 11th to the 14th century and became known as scholasticism. The second stage focused attention on human achievement. It was the age of inner-motivated men who emphasized human values and rational thought. This philosophy of life continued through the 16th century. The third stage that contributed to the Renaissance came in 1453 with the fall of Constantinople.
Thank you very much. It was only 3 years after the fall of Constantinople that the first Bible was printed here in the city of Mainz. It happened on August the 15th in 1456. And the man that was responsible for bringing it to us was a man named Johann Gutenberg. I'm sitting in a little outside cafeteria with a market behind me and the Cathedral of Mainz in the background, and around the corner from me is the Gutenberg Museum. Johann Gutenberg didn't take his name from his father. He actually took it from the place where his mother was born. But his story is a story of vision and of failure. It's a fascinating and it's a very sad story. It happens that the last of his Bibles that was sold in New York City for $5.5 million. And yet the story of his life is of vision and frustration, with millions in the bank, but not the 25 cents he needed for the taxi cab to get there and pick it up.
As a boy, he entertained himself in his father's workshop by carving the separate letters of his name on soft wood. He placed them on his father's table when the H fell into a bucket of purple dye. He quickly retrieved it, and he let it rest to dry on a piece of paper. The impression it left on the paper and in his mind was indelible. This was where the concept of a printing press with movable type was born. It took some 40 years for the press to move from an idea to a reality. Building a press was expensive and required money, and it was money that he did not have. About 1450, a lawyer by the name of Johann Voss invested in Gutenberg's new enterprise. When Gutenberg ran into financial difficulties, Voss took legal proceedings against him, apparently won the case, and moved the press and tools to his own house in Mainz. There, with the assistance of Peter Schoeffer, they published various books. It is not known if the Bible had been printed previous to this court case. If it had, all its proceeds would have undoubtedly gone to Voss.
He died in 1468, and he was destitute and he was forgotten. He was buried in a little Franciscan church here, but that church was demolished and another one was built in its place. And that one was demolished, and you can't find his grave today. And it's very sad, because you take one page of human history, and a man that made such a significant contribution to it is almost out of the picture altogether. A man that created a machine that literally became a guillotine to ignorance in the Middle Ages. And he's gone, and he's forgotten. You know, 30 years after his death, his machines were seen in all the major cities all over Europe. You could go anywhere from Rome to Barcelona and you could find his machines. In the city of Venice, for example, there were 151 printing shops. If you were to go to Wittenberg, there's a man there that lived by the name of Luft, and before he died, he printed 100,000 Bibles. There's a man by the name of William Caxton who came over here to the continent on business, and while he was in the city of Cologne, he was exposed to the printing process. Fascinated him. When he went back to England, he took a printing press with him and he set it up in Westminster. He only produced 96 separate works with 18,000 pages, but he left something that caused the future reformers to dream a dream, and their dream became a reality.
During this rebirth of knowledge that came to be known as the Renaissance, Greek became the important language of the humanists of that day. In October 26, 1467, a child came into the world who was to become the greatest humanist of his day.
His father, who was a monk, called him Erasmus. His brother Peter and he were both illegitimate children, though his mother and his father married later in life. He was 8 years of age before he got an opportunity for education. He went to the School of the Brethren of the Common Life in a city called Deventer. And he made some important friends there, one of which was to become the future Pope.
When he was 11 years of age, both his mother and father died of the plague. He eventually became a boarder at an Augustine monastery, and on April the 25th in 1492, he became an Augustinian monk. He had a gift of writing poetry, but to augment his income, he started learning and teaching Greek. He was invited to become a student of Greek at Oxford. He was welcomed by the intelligentsia, and he met a 19-year-old boy whose name was Thomas More, the future Chancellor of England. They were to become lifelong friends. More took him to the royal nursery to meet a 9-year-old Henry, who was the future King of England known as Henry VIII. On every occasion, he dazzled and amazed his friends with his sharp mind and his keen wit. His friendships were eventually influential everywhere, even with the Pope in Rome.
There's no question, but there is a missing factor in the story. This man became so popular. What was it that created his popularity? Unquestionably, it was his pain. And that's what brings me here to the city of Brussels. And I'm here because this is a house in which he lived that had been built back in the middle of the 15th century out of Flemish brick. And he's not the only notable person that lived here, because a friend of his that later became the Pope in Rome also lived in this house. And today it's a museum. And this museum is the largest single collection of his writings that we can find in any single place in the world today. What writings? You remember we talked previously about the poems that were written in the 1490s. And then that gave way to the Manual of the Christian Soldier. In that work, he didn't mean to condemn the church. He just wanted to point out to them that the dogma and the ritual of the church was irrelevant to the day in which he lived. And it was the first kind of writing by a notable person that had been done. And oh, what a reaction it brought. You see, all the men that were hungry for the Reformation immediately caught on to it. So much so that William Tyndale, for example, translated it into English, had it printed, and then circulated at his own expense. Then, you remember in 1505, he's living in the home of Sir Thomas More in London, and he writes his In Praise of Folly. It was his analysis of the church of his day. He believed that they were simply servants or slaves, if you would, to folly itself. And that included kings and bishops and princes and even popes. That's the reason for which, when you look at some of this literature here, you'll see sections of it inked out, crossed over. The people that belonged to the Church of Rome in his day were very concerned about what he was doing, believing that he was actually feeding what would ultimately divide the church. And there's no question about it, it did divide the church. But that brought us down to the most significant work that he wrote in his lifetime. The year is 1516. He started doing his translation of the Greek New Testament previously. He had finished it while he was a teacher at Queen's College in Cambridge, and that tower, named the Erasmus Tower, is dedicated to him because that's the place where he terminated his translating work. Then he put it together on a page, for example, divided in two. On one half he put the Greek text, and on the other half he put his Latin translations. And then he dedicated the entire work to Pope Leo X. That kind of secured for him at least the outward favor of the church and promised him that he'd be able to sell the product. Unfortunately, it was banned in most countries almost immediately. But you see what happened? It just fell like seed on the ground. There's no other way to describe it, because Martin Luther got a look at it and then decided he could translate that Greek into the German of his day, and he gave the Germans a Bible. That's exactly the thing that Zwingli and Calvin did for the people that lived in Switzerland. That's exactly the same thing that William Tyndale did for the people that lived in England. And then it went through editions. It was the 4th and 5th edition, according to Philip Schaff, the church historian, that became the Textus Receptus. And if you're not familiar with that term, that's the document that the translators of the King James Version of the Bible in 1611 used to do their translation from. No, before I conclude, I've got to admit, Erasmus did not intend to split the church. As far as he was concerned, the conflagration that came was not coming with his purpose or intent, but he was standing in the dry timber, and he was playing with matches. He himself admitted that he laid the egg, and Luther hatched it.
One man stands above all others when you talk about the Protestant Reformation: Martin Luther. He was the very center of this religious cleavage with the Church of Rome, but he was also to play a vital role in the story of the Bible. Martin Luther was born on November the 10th in 1483. He entered the Augustinian monastery and had already earned his B.A. and his M.A. A year later, he took his vows to become a monk. In 1511, he was transferred to the monastery at Wittenberg and became a professor of biblical literature. A priest by the name of John Titzel was selling indulgences. Indulgences were a form of penance by price, allowing people to purchase a piece of paper which afforded them the right to commit sins, the degree of which was determined by the price they paid. Luther strongly resented the practice. At the same time, he was lecturing on the book of Romans. He discovered the verse in Romans 1:17. He concluded that a man in Christ, through faith, may have the righteousness of God transferred to his credit. There was no need of indulgences or other forms of penance. This became his great conversion experience. It was the combination of these things which led to the famous 95 Theses, which were nailed to the castle church door at Wittenberg in 1517. In these theses, he severely attacked the church. He took issue with every doctrine that was not founded on the Scriptures. In 1520, Pope Leo X issued a bull requiring him to recant under the threat of excommunication. In 1521, at an assembly at Worms, he gave his immortal statement: "Here I stand, my conscience is captive to the Word of God." This is the actual location of this landmark meeting. Then on December 10, 1521, he publicly burned the papal bull. His pen became very active. His publications attacked the doctrines of the Church that he felt were at odds with the Scripture.
I'm standing in a room where this man lived. He walked through this door. He stepped on these wooden boards. He warmed himself at that furnace. And there is no question about it, he needed friends, sacred and secular. And these writings accomplished that purpose. There were other treatises that were going to be written afterward, and the greatest of them was his theological contribution, which he titled The Bondage of the Will. He printed that in 1525. It was done in response to a vicious attack by the humanist Desiderius Erasmus.
That same year, when he was 42 years of age, there was a peasants' revolt, and he had to write a denial of association. In fact, he wrote an inflammatory condemnation of the revolt. It was in the same year that he married Catherine von Bora.
I'm sitting amidst the furniture that Luther sat amidst. He sat on these chairs. He sat by this table. If any guests were in his house, it was from this table that he led his evening devotions. And there's no question he was a reformer. A rebel is a person that tries to change the past. A reformer is a person that tries to change the future. And every religious reformer knows that you can't affect succeeding generations unless you provide them with a Bible in their own vernacular. That makes the years important for his pen, the years preceding September of 1522, when for the first time for Luther of printing presses in the German language came a New Testament.
His most important work was the translation of the German Bible. It was a translation from the Erasmus Greek New Testament. In his arrangement, Hebrews, James, Jude, and Revelation were placed at the end of the publication as non-canonical. He did not believe that they could claim the right of inspiration. Within the first 14 years of the completion of that Bible, it, or portions of it, went through 377 editions.
He taught the world how to protest against the evils of popes and potentates of that day. And not only protest, but make it permanent. And he did that by providing a Bible in the language that everybody understood.
Luther wasn't the only champion of the European Reformation. Ulrich Zwingli was responsible for translating the Zurich Bible for the people of Switzerland. If Lutheranism was born in Wittenberg, then Presbyterianism was born in Geneva. John Calvin was the most notable pioneer of this reform. He was without parallel in the area of theology. The other reformers wrote and argued doctrine, but not to the measure and depth characteristic of Calvin. He also built the only university for the training of Reformed ministers and made Geneva the capital city of the Reformed movement. Calvin ruled Geneva with an iron fist. Now the Protestants took their turn at persecuting. 58 executions occurred. In fact, 34 women were burned on a suspicion of spreading the plague by magical means. Geneva became the Rome of Protestantism for some 6,000 refugees from England, Scotland, and France.
I'm sitting here on a bridge that goes over the River Cam in Cambridge. And I'm thinking about some great rivers of which we're not sure where the source is. And as it is with rivers, it is certainly true of great movements. There's no question when you talk about the Reformation and you think of Germany, you automatically think of Martin Luther. In Switzerland, it's Ulrich Zwingli or John Calvin. In Scotland, it's John Knox. But in England, the source of that movement was really the indestructible book. There's no question in our mind that there were certain personalities that helped it along, striding in its progress. And if we try to find the initiator of those personalities, it's probably a little man by the name of Thomas Bíbliuni.
Bíbliuni was born in the city of Norwich around 1495. He was a student at Trinity Hall in Cambridge, majoring in the field of canon law. Two factors left an uneasy balance in Bíbliuni's life. First, Bíbliuni's religious life was barren and non-productive. Fastings, vigils, and indulgences had left him with empty pockets, empty health, and an empty heart. Secondly, the Erasmus Greek New Testament had crossed his path. Published the previous year, it had survived the blacklist ban placed on it and was known to be in the religious subculture of Cambridge. One night he went out and he bought a black market copy of that Erasmus Greek New Testament. He came to the words of Paul in 1 Timothy 1:15, which stated that Christ came to this world to save sinners, and he admitted that he was the worst. Those words shot through his heart. On the spot he trusted in the Christ of those pages. Doubt gave way to assurance, and an effervescent joy dominated his heart. He had to share his newfound faith with others. He picked the white horse in for the field in which to sow his seed. It was a pub where the academic superiors of Cambridge assembled and discussed subjects prohibited in the classroom. It was nicknamed Little Germany because it discussed so much of Luther's writings. Bíbliuni brought his New Testament to their discussion tables. The result was cataclysmic. The news spread through Cambridge and began to attract notable lecturers from the university. But these men were being converted by their exposure to Bíbliuni's New Testament. This small group of men was eventually to produce 2 archbishops and 8 martyrs. But among these notable academicians was a young man by the name of William Tyndale. Tyndale was no ordinary student. Born in 1494, we know that he graduated with his master's in 1515 from Magdalen Hall in Oxford. At this time, Thomas Wolsey, the Archbishop of York, was waging an all-out assault on the reformers. In fact, in 1517, at Little Park in Coventry, 5 men and 2 women were tried for heresy. The charge was that they were teaching their children the Lord's Prayer and the 10 Commandments in English. They were found guilty and burned to death in the public square. Wolsey was also relentless in his search for forbidden books at Oxford. The influence of the Lollards was still strongly felt in Oxford, and Wolsey sought to destroy every forbidden book that he could get his hand on. When Tyndale heard about Bíbliuni's White Horse Inn fellowship in 1519, he left Oxford for the more tolerant Cambridge and became associated with this secretive Bible study group.
It was here in Cambridge that Tyndale discovered the spellbinding and regenerating power of the Bible. He knew that the revival was confined to Cambridge only because of its culture. And if the ordinary man cannot rise to the culture of Cambridge, then the Bible must step down to the level of ordinary understanding. Thus, the task of his life and the cause of his death was to translate the Bible into the language of the common man.
He was an excellent Greek scholar, and he was also a great debater of the Scriptures. A certain clergyman taunted Tyndale by saying, "We were better to be without God's law than the Pope's." Tyndale fired back, "I defy the Pope and all his laws. If God spares my life ere many years, I will cause the boy that drives the plough to know more about the Scriptures than you." At the age of 30, he decided that the mission of his life would be to translate the Bible into English. He may have never realized that this project would eventually earn him the title, the Father of the English Bible. He became employed by the John Walsh family at Little Sodbury Manor in the Cotswold Hills near Bristol, the area from which he came. He became the chaplain of Sir John Walsh and his wife, and the tutor of their 2 children. And it was in this home where he started the assignment of translating the Greek into English. This little attic room happens to be the private room of William Tyndale while he worked for the Walsh family. Here he slept, and here he kept his books, and here he studied. The idea came to him that if the Greek New Testament had such a profound effect upon the scholastic world, what would an English Bible do for plowboys? At this very spot, he decided he was going to translate the Greek New Testament into English. He appealed to the Bishop of London, Cuthbert Tunstall, to rescind the law passed against the Lollards forbidding any use of Scripture other than in Latin. But it was futile. Tyndale therefore determined to exile himself from his native land, and he set sail for the continent to accomplish his great mission. Tyndale traveled to Wittenberg to finish the translation of the New Testament. Luther and Tyndale were strongly united by the same motto, sola scriptura, only the Scriptures. The city became a refuge for the outlaw. The printing was the most difficult task of all. In Cologne, they found a willing printer. English spies broke up the operation, coming through the front door while Tyndale escaped through the back with whatever copies were finished. It was a narrow escape. They then traveled to Worms, where they found another willing printer. In December 1525, they accomplished the task, and the New Testaments were ready for shipping. He had made good friends with the London port authorities, and they determined the best way to smuggle this forbidden book into the country was by placing them in sacks of flour that were being imported into England. Thousands of Tyndale's Bibles were reaching the shore of England, and the words of the English translation were fermenting a national unrest. Today you can see a statue of Tyndale that overlooks the port where his Bibles reached England. The opposition which came to the Reformed movement in England came from the established church, from the crown, and from humanism. The religious opposition was expected, as the two forces were antagonistic in every respect. The established church came to be caricatured in the person of Thomas Wolsey, the last Roman Catholic prelate to rule over England. His power and wealth was graphically illustrated by the incredible home which he built for himself called Hampton Court. It was even larger than the royal residence.
He was a devout Roman Catholic, and he was sold out lock, stock, and barrel for the advancement of that church in this country. To that end, he became the leader of a crusade to stamp out heretics, and that caused good and godly men to lose their property, to languish in prison, and some of them even to burn at a stake.
In the meantime, Henry VIII was the other voice of opposition to the Reformers. He was strongly opposed to the Lollards and the cause of the Reformation. In fact, the Pope had declared him the protector of the Church. Sir Thomas More became the third voice of opposition. More was an ideal Catholic. He submitted to fasts and vigils, scourged himself every Friday. He would sleep on the bare ground using a log for a pillow. He eventually became the Chancellor of England, the first layman ever to hold this powerful office. He strongly denounced Tyndale's doctrine, especially his English Bible. More determined that Tyndale must be assassinated. In 1528, Bishop Tunstall licensed More to refute the works of Tyndale in what became known as the Pen and Ink Wars. Tyndale's New Testament was having such an impact on the nation that the king condemned them to public burning at St. Paul's Cross, harassed and persecuted all found guilty of possessing or distributing them, and even raised money to buy out Tyndale's operation.
It was Tunstall who authorized Augustine Packington, a merchantman that did a lot of trade in Antwerp, to go over to the continent, buy every Bible available to be bought, bring it back here to St. Paul's Cathedral, and have it publicly burned. What Tunstall didn't know was that Packington was a friend of William Tyndale's, and he paid him 4 times the cost of production for every Bible he bought, which means that for every Bible that they burned here at St. Paul's, he paid to have it replaced and then added 3 more to Tyndale's arsenal.
Tyndale's Bible was just the tool that the pioneer reformers needed. Bíbliuni, who was the initiator of this revolution, undoubtedly relied on this precious book. But in 1527, he was arrested while preaching in Ipswich.
They put him in a cell in the Tower of London, but they left the door open, and they played a cat-and-a-mouse game with him. They let his friends come in and out to try and dissuade him from becoming a martyr, and they succeeded. On December the 7th in 1527, he signed an abjuration, and the following day was a Sunday. They walked him that morning through public thoroughfare all the way from the Tower of London to St. Paul's Cathedral. When he got here, he listened to a sermon that denounced his heresy. And at this very location, they had a stack of William Tyndale's Bibles, and it was his job to ignite the Bibles and burn them. That event shattered his soul. It demented his spirit. He made his mind up that he was going to get arrested again. And in Norwich, in 1531, he accomplished that. Though he was tried in London, he was sentenced to be executed here in the city of Norwich, because this was the place where he held his greatest influence. And he spent his last night on earth on August the 8th, 1531, in this damp, dark cell that was built in 1407. They had a table spread where he was sitting eating his last meal, just on the other side of that pillar. Five of his friends came to visit him to try and comfort and console him. They were led by Matthew Parker, who was later to become the Archbishop of Canterbury under the reign of Elizabeth I. They came down that spiral, narrow staircase. They filed over to the end of the table where he was eating his meal, and they gave him words to try and fortify him. He didn't need fortification. He was totally committed to die for Christ. Had they offered him a pardon, it would only have disappointed him. The more they spoke about the flames being cooled by the Spirit of God, quietly he finished his meal. When he'd completed, he pushed the plate apart, got a finger on his Bible, and pulled it down the table to where they were sitting. and in their dumb silence, unexplained, he simply rested his elbow on the table, put his index finger out and held it over the open flame of a candle. And he held it there until it burned his finger to the bone. As they watched in silence, he pointed toward the open Bible on the table beside him and read the reference he'd just been reading before in Isaiah 43 verse 2, "When thou walkest through the fire, thou shalt not be burned." He commented that to burn for any other reason than dying for Christ would burn. But with Christ in the flames, they don't burn. And it was in that frame of mind he spent his last night in this cell.
As they took him from the cell, they crossed the bishop's bridge, and he ran to embrace the stake and thank God for the privilege of having a second opportunity to die for Christ. He was a noble example for his contemporaries. First, he taught the reformers how to live for Christ, and then he taught them how to die for him. When men were beheaded, usually gentlemen, it was normally done at Tower Hill. When they were hanged, usually common people, it was done at Tyburn. And when they were burned, those guilty of religious crimes, it was done at Smithfield.
A statue should be erected to the noble men and women that burned to death here at Smithfield. They were all courageous, but some of them exemplified uncommon valor. They were human. That must be remembered. They were as human as you are, as I am. Their bodies were subject to pain. Their bones were as brittle as ours. They floated on waves of emotion. Sometimes it took them up to ecstatic heights, and sometimes it dropped them down to the deepest valleys of despair. Some of them were not taken against their will. They consented to their ordeal. They did so because they had convictions that went like shafts of steel into their soul, and it wouldn't let them bend to pressure. Or some of them were weak, and they recanted. But then they found the courage to refortify themselves and turn around and face the ordeal all over again. Some of them were strong, burly, stout men. Some of them were weak, fragile, sensitive women. But all of them were heroes.
The cause of the Reformation and the story of the English Bible hold a great debt of gratitude, ironically, to the carnal passions of King Henry VIII. His first marriage with Catherine of Aragon had produced 6 children, but only one girl survived infancy, the future Bloody Mary. King Henry blamed Catherine for the failure to provide him a son. Then her fate was sealed when the king cast his eyes on a young woman by the name of Anne Boleyn.
She had an oval face, bright eyes, black hair. She walked with dignity. It said that she had a sweet singing voice, and she danced elegantly. Whenever the king was despondent, it was always her songs and her laughter that cheered him up and attracted him like a magnet. He wrote letters to her, but most of them were in French. In them he admitted that he had a deep love for her, but she had no intention of becoming his mistress. When he saw the resolute of her morals, he then proposed marriage to her. But his divorce had not yet been complete, so she declined. When he appealed to her father to help him in the proposal, the father encouraged her, and she decided that if he would ever get a divorce, she would become his wife. It must be realized that a divorce from Catherine, followed by a Protestant queen, was tantamount to a break with Rome. Cardinal Wolsey could see the writing on the wall. he was unable to convince the king that he shouldn't seek the divorce, and equally unable to convince him that he shouldn't marry Anne. And he knew as inevitable as the fall of gravity that it would mean his fall from grace. One historian put it, and I think put it well. He said 1,000 Wolseleys was not worth one Anne Boleyn.
When the Pope, for various political reasons, did not grant the divorce, Wolsey saw that he had lost his influence, and the king replaced Wolsey with Sir Thomas More. The king, upset that the church would not grant him a divorce from Catherine, made a monumental decision that was to sever its relationship with Rome. In 1534, Parliament passed an act denoting the king to be the sole and supreme head on earth of the Church of England. Sir Thomas More could not subscribe to this decision. He was arrested and put in the Tower. He spent 1 year there and refused to recant. For this he became known as the man for all seasons. He was placed on trial for high treason, and 7 days later was executed outside the Tower. A man by the name of Thomas Cranmer was to play a significant role in the continuing story of the indestructible book. In 1533, he had been consecrated as the Archbishop of Canterbury. He defended the king's decision. It was he that declared the marriage to Catherine null and void. On June the 1st, 1535, Cranmer crowned Anne Boleyn as queen and became the godfather of their daughter, the future Queen Elizabeth. When Tyndale's New Testaments had reached the shores of England, there were many in the church, and one on the throne that thought the only way to stop him was to have him burned. Bounty hunters from England were traveling all over the continent, wearing disguises and paying for information, but all without success. He began the translation of the Old Testament. He eventually moved to Antwerp. Even though the king had severed from the Catholic Church, he was still very much opposed to Tyndale.
Tyndale soon learned what it was like to be the fox out in the country surrounded by the hound. It didn't take him long to learn how to live like a fugitive and to wander like a vagabond from city to city like this German city behind me, and sometimes cross over the boundaries into other countries. He wore many different disguises, and what made him particularly difficult to locate was the fact that he spoke 7 languages with such fluency that you couldn't determine which one was his native tongue. And I deeply and sincerely feel for the man, though he's in a page of history. I do so because I know that he must have lived with fears and with trepidation that was part of his life, day after day, if not hour after hour.
In 1535, while he was in Antwerp, Henry Phillips, posing as a friend, betrayed the identity of the reformer. He was captured, taken into custody, and imprisoned in the impregnable Vilvoorde Castle near Brussels in Belgium. He was found guilty of sacrilege, but it was not until Friday, October the 6th in 1536 that they brought him out to exact his capital punishment. This monument commemorates that historic event.
It was not until Friday, October 6th in 1536 that they brought him from his cell to the place of public execution. There was no reticence, there was no regret, there was no hesitation. When they brought him to the stake against which he was going to be chained and burned to death, he noticed that it had one unique feature about it. There were 2 holes in the stake through which a piece of wire was to be threaded that went around his neck because, according to the court, he had to be strangled at the same time that he was going to be burned. And when the executioner was putting the wire through the hole and marking it around his throat, he made his last recorded public statement. And his statement was in the form of a prayer. Lord, open the King of England's eyes.
They strangled his voice, they burned his hand, they ravaged and destroyed his property, burning every Bible they could find. Though only one of his first edition New Testaments has survived the biblical Holocaust, his commitment inspired thousands, his priorities gave guidance to the movement, and his translation influenced every succeeding one, until 90% of his work filtered unchanged into the best-selling book of all time, the King James Version of 1611.